In 1983, on the edge of a quiet German farming village called Talheim, a team of workers digging a trench for a new home uncovered something unexpected. Beneath the soil, in what looked like a shallow pit, lay dozens of human skeletons. Jumbled, overlapping, without coffins, markers, or offerings, there were 34 individuals in total. Men, women, children, no pattern of burial, no sign of disease, and nearly all bore one unmistakable mark: violence. Carbon-14 dating placed the grave at around 5000 BCE in the early Neolithic period, during a time when Europe was slowly transitioning from mobile hunting to sedentary agriculture. The people buried at Talheim were members of a farming culture known as the linear pottery culture, among the first in Central Europe to build permanent settlements and cultivate the land. What shocked archaeologists was the consistency of the trauma. Most of the victims had been killed by powerful blows to the head, likely with a stone axe. Some had multiple fractures to the skull or spine. A few had been struck from behind, as if trying to flee. At least 2 showed signs of having been bound or restrained. There were no signs of a struggle, no buried weapons, no defensive wounds that would suggest battle. There was only killing, thousands of kilometers away, across the African continent, and thousands of years earlier. Another site would later reveal a similar story. In 2012, researchers uncovered skeletal remains on the western shore of Lake Turkana, Kenya, a site now known as Nataruk. There, in what had once been a lakeside hunting camp, 12 adult skeletons and several children were found sprawled in the silt. They had died violently. One man had an obsidian blade still embedded in his skull. Another had a shattered knee and crushed ribs. A pregnant woman lay curled on her side, her wrists bound behind her back. The remains were dated to around 10,000 years ago in the late Pleistocene or early Holocene, long before settled villages or formal states. These were mobile foragers, and yet they had not died by accident or animal attack. The evidence pointed clearly to an intentional and systematic slaughter. There were no burials, no grave goods, no ritual, just bodies. Archaeologists and forensic specialists found themselves faced with a difficult truth. These were not the deaths of individuals caught in natural disaster. These were not ceremonial killings. These were massacres. The deaths at Talheim and Nataruk, separated by 5,000 years and 2 continents, challenge a long-held assumption that violence came only with civilization. That war was born with kings, cities, and the invention of property. The evidence now suggests otherwise. These people lived in small bands, without written language, without organized states. They were bound by kinship, surrounded by threats, and forced to fight for land, food, and survival. And at times they turned against each other in ways that can only be described as deliberate and systematic. The sites raised disturbing questions. What could provoke such violence among prehistoric peoples? Was it territorial, driven by scarcity, revenge? Were women and children targeted intentionally or caught in the path of something worse? And perhaps most disturbingly, was this normal? The mass grave at Talheim was not the only one of its kind. Similar discoveries have been made across Neolithic Europe: Schletz Asparn in Austria, Kiljazanmäki in Finland, and Herxheim, also in Germany. At each, the remains of men, women, and children bear the unmistakable signs of organized prehistoric violence. These are not fictional tales. They are not moral parables. They are not warnings from mythology. They are data, bones, patterns, burials without dignity, and they force us to ask a question that cuts deeper than archaeology. Were we always like this? Even before we called ourselves nations or gods or kings? Was this part of what it meant to be human? That question is what this investigation will explore. But before we jump right into it, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, but only if you enjoy what I do here. uncovering the dark side of history they never taught us in school. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to connect with you, my friends from all over the world, joining me on this journey through the past. Because this is not a journey into mythology. It is a journey into the soil, into the wounds that never healed, into the first graves that whispered a secret no one wanted to believe. That prehistoric life was not peaceful, it was fragile, and it was brutal. To understand what happened at Talheim and Nataruk, we must first understand the world these people inhabited, not as myth, but as fact. Not through the lens of fiction, but through the slow, careful excavation of what remains. The Talheim massacre took place around 5000 BCE in the heart of Neolithic Europe. This was the age of early agriculture. The people were farmers belonging to the linear band ceramic, or linear pottery culture, a society that had only recently begun to settle permanently, cultivate grain, and domesticate animals. They lived in wooden longhouses grouped into small clusters along rivers or fertile plains. Each house might have held a family of 10 to 20 people. By contrast, the massacre at Nataruk, dated to around 8000 BCE, occurred in a hunter-gatherer world. These were mobile foragers, people without farms, villages, or storage. They depended on wild animals, seasonal plants, and access to fresh water. Their shelters were temporary. Their tools were crafted from bone, obsidian, and flint. Life was organized around movement, dictated by the rains, the herds, and the hunger. In both worlds, life was precarious. Estimates of global population at this time vary, but the most generous figures suggest no more than 5 million humans on the entire planet. Across vast territories, small bands of 20 to 50 people formed the basic social unit. A single epidemic, a drought, or an attack could wipe out an entire group in days. Housing, where it existed, was basic. At Talheim, longhouses were constructed from timber, daub, and thatched roofing, fragile structures that left little trace once abandoned. In foraging regions like Nataruk, people slept in makeshift shelters, animal hides draped over branches, fire pits surrounded by tools, the ground swept clean of debris. Food scarcity was constant. Even the most successful Neolithic farmers were at the mercy of weather and soil. Failed harvests brought starvation. Foragers relied on luck, memory, and cooperation to follow food across vast and dangerous landscapes. Both groups supplemented their diets with wild game, fish, fruits, and edible roots. But famine was a regular presence. Their tools were sharp, functional, and deadly. Flint blades, stone axes, spear points, digging sticks, and obsidian knives, each one fashioned by hand, each one capable of killing. Clothing was utilitarian. Skins from deer, cattle, or goat were scraped and softened into simple tunics. At times, plant fibers were twisted into cordage for belts, pouches, or primitive sandals. In colder climates, fur-lined garments and cloaks were used, though few survive in the archaeological record. Language almost certainly existed, but no trace remains. There were no alphabets, no writing, no records, only what can be inferred from burial goods, tool use, and the patterns left behind in discarded bones and forgotten hearths. Children rarely survived beyond age 5. Those who did were expected to work as soon as they could walk. Women likely faced high mortality from childbirth. Healed fractures in adult skeletons show that pain and injury were constant companions. Disease, from parasites, wounds, or contaminated water, would have been both common and fatal. Burial sites from this period often contain signs of physical hardship, arthritic joints, dental abscesses, signs of malnutrition, and trauma from blunt injury appear frequently in skeletal remains. There were no doctors, no sanitation, no medicine beyond plants and guesswork. In such conditions, fear was not abstract, it was daily. It was embedded in the weather, the soil, the bones of the sick, and the silence of a child who did not wake. And yet, humans endured. They adapted. They built tools. They made fire. They raised children and buried their dead. They formed families. They created meaning in the face of hunger and loss. It is important to understand that prehistoric life was not constant savagery, but it was always on the edge. Life was short, death was near, and the margins for survival were brutally thin. This fragile world, sometimes cooperative, sometimes violent, is the backdrop against which events like Talheim and Nataruk must be understood. These people did not live in some noble Eden or dystopian nightmare. They lived in a real world where choices were shaped by scarcity, fear, loyalty, and the limits of what the earth could provide. To survive, they sometimes had to make decisions that seem unthinkable today. And in some cases, when food ran out, or strangers approached, or old tensions rose, they chose violence. That world is not extinct. It lives beneath our feet, preserved in the shape of skulls, the cracks in long bones, the residue of soot, ash, and blood. It is not a world we must imagine. It is a world we have already excavated. When we think of the earliest humans, we often picture resilience, adaptability in the face of cold, predators, and disease. But sometimes resilience demanded terrible choices. Not heroic, not admirable, just necessary. In certain places, at certain times, survival meant crossing moral boundaries that we today might not understand. Among the most disturbing patterns in prehistoric archaeology is the recurring presence of cannibalism. This is not speculation, it is evidenced in the bones. At Guff's Cave in Somerset, England, dated to around 15,000 years ago, human remains were found with precise butchery marks. Limbs had been carefully disarticulated, long bones split lengthwise, the marrow removed. Skulls were processed in a way that suggested they were not just discarded, but cleaned, shaped, and possibly used as cups. These were not the actions of animals. They were methodical, cold, human. At El Sidron in Spain, Neanderthal bones dating to about 49,000 years ago revealed similar patterns. At least 12 individuals had been killed, dismembered, and consumed. The evidence included cut marks, fractures from marrow extraction, and the burning of select bones. There were children among the victims. In Moula-Guercy, a cave in southeastern France, human bones dating to the Paleolithic were found among the remains of butchered deer. Both had been processed in the same manner: cut marks, marrow removal, defleshing. In each of these sites, the story is brutally consistent. The dead were consumed, not ceremonially, not with reverence, but as food. Was this desperation? Probably. There is strong support for the idea that these were episodes of survival cannibalism, choices made in times of extreme famine or environmental stress. But not all evidence fits that explanation. At Herxheim, a site in Germany dating to the 6th millennium BCE, over 500 individuals were found. Many had been dismembered, skulls arranged in arcs, bones deliberately broken. Some showed signs of cooking. There were too many bodies for a single famine. No signs of mass disease, and yet the violence was systematic. Some archaeologists believe Herxheim represents ritual cannibalism, possibly sacrificial, possibly symbolic, used as a form of warfare or spiritual terror. Others argue that it may have been a regional form of ritual dismemberment with limited consumption. The debate continues. The idea of sacrificing humans to protect the living, or to feed them, is not a modern invention. It is an old one. But cannibalism was not the only grim response to scarcity. There is growing evidence that in periods of stress, prehistoric people sometimes abandoned the vulnerable, especially the elderly, the injured, and the very young. Burial data shows an overrepresentation of infants in mass graves and cemeteries. particularly in cultures where food scarcity or migration would have made child-rearing dangerously costly. In some cases, infant bodies were deposited without burial care. No ochre, no tools, no offerings, just discarded. It is impossible to determine intent with certainty. Infant mortality was naturally high in the Paleolithic and Neolithic. But when the burial pattern repeats, hundreds of infants, few women, it raises questions. Were some of these deaths intentional acts of population control? Infanticide, not as cruelty, but as a tragic necessity. Some anthropologists point to comparative cases in more recent traditional societies where this did occur, particularly when groups were under severe environmental pressure. Then there are the abandoned elderly, individuals found with advanced joint degeneration, evidence of disease or disability, sometimes deposited in isolated locations. In rare cases, they are found alone, unburied, surrounded by animal gnaw marks. They had been left, not killed, but not protected. There is no proof of murder in these cases, but there is no sign of rescue either. Sometimes, survival meant keeping the strong alive, at the expense of those who could no longer contribute. And then there are the dead who appear to have been sacrificed intentionally. In certain sites, especially in late Neolithic Europe and early Bronze Age contexts, we find children buried with care, but in unnatural positions. Fetal curl, face down, bound hands, no family members nearby. In Dolní Věstonice, a site in the Czech Republic dated to about 26,000 years ago, a burial of 2 adolescent males and 1 woman was found. The woman had a severely deformed spine and leg, possibly from a congenital condition. All 3 were buried at the same time, their bodies arranged with apparent intentionality. The meaning of the burial is unclear, but the pairing of the disabled and the young, buried with ochre and ornaments, raises the possibility of symbolic death. Were these acts of compassion, of fear, of utility? We cannot know what the people of Talheim or Nataruk believed about death. But what we see in the bones is this. When the world pressed in too hard, when the food disappeared, when the band could not go on as it was, choices were made. Some were buried, some were eaten, some were left behind. It was not about cruelty. It was about survival, about keeping just enough alive to continue. This was not a time of comfort. This was a time of thresholds, when life walked just one step ahead of death, and morality bent to the will of the season. The record is not complete. The evidence is not always clear, but the pattern is real. At the edge of extinction, human beings did what they had to do, and what they had to do, at times, was horrifying. Human history did not begin in peace. For a long time, scholars hoped that violence was a byproduct of civilization, that war arrived with wealth, hierarchy, and states. But the bones say otherwise. Violence was already here, before writing, before metal, before cities. The evidence is not a matter of myth or speculation. It is forensic, statistical, cut into skulls and embedded in spines. At Talheim, dated to circa 5000 BCE, 34 individuals were buried in a shallow pit, not side by side, but haphazardly, bodies overlapping. Most had died from blunt force trauma, likely from stone axes. Many were struck from behind. Some had multiple injuries, suggesting overkill or execution. The dead included women and children. There were no signs of burial care, no attempt to arrange or protect the bodies, only disposal. At Nataruk, dated to roughly 10,000 years ago, near Lake Turkana in Kenya, archaeologists discovered the remains of at least 27 individuals. They were not buried. Their bodies were left exposed, scattered across an ancient lakeshore. Among them, a woman 8 months pregnant, her wrists tied behind her back. A man with a crushed skull and broken ribs. another with an obsidian blade still lodged in his jaw. The people at Nataruk were foragers, mobile, land-dependent, small in number, and still they had been systematically slaughtered. These two sites, separated by thousands of kilometers and millennia, tell the same story. Intentional, organized violence, not for ritual, not for justice, but for elimination. Similar evidence appears at other Neolithic and Mesolithic sites across Europe and Asia. At Aspern, Schlitz, in Austria, another mass grave from around 5,200 BCE revealed over 60 individuals, many with crushed skulls. Arms were missing. The dead showed signs of being hunted, not in battle, but during flight. The attackers did not just kill, they mutilated. At Herxheim in Germany, the remains of hundreds of individuals, many showing cut marks, broken bones, and skulls arranged in pits, suggest repeated episodes of group violence over time. Some researchers interpret the site as ritualistic, others as militaristic, but the method of death was clear, controlled, human-delivered, and repeated. The weapons used in these attacks were primitive, but effective. Stone axes, flint-tipped spears, clubs carved from hardwood, obsidian blades. These were tools made for hunting animals, but they were just as deadly when turned against people. The trauma found on the bones is consistent across regions. Depressed fractures to the parietal and occipital bones, consistent with blows to the head. Clean cuts along ribs and long bones, consistent with slicing. Penetrating wounds through eye sockets, spinal columns, and pelvic bones. In multiple sites, researchers found defensive injuries, raised forearms shattered while shielding the face, or torsos turned in protection. These were not instant killings. Some victims had time to react. Others were likely immobilized before death. Patterns emerge, and they are not random. In several mass graves, including Talheim and Schlitz, adult males are disproportionately absent. Most of the dead are women, children, and elderly. This suggests that the attackers may have targeted the unprotected, or that the adult men were taken, escaped, or perhaps executed elsewhere. This gendered pattern raises questions. In some interpretations, the attackers spared reproductively valuable females. In others, they took them. In still others, they killed them all. The motive is never written down, but archaeology provides possibilities. One possibility is territorial conflict. As populations grew and farming became more established, land became more valuable, not just for food, but for survival. In these scenarios, violence may have been used to eliminate competitors, seize fields, or control resources. Another possibility is retribution. Raids answered by counterattacks, creating cycles of vengeance between neighboring groups. Some violence may have been preemptive, meant to deter future threats. Some may have been symbolic, tied to ritual or belief. In a few rare cases, the violence may have served no larger purpose than control, but in nearly all cases, the violence appears to have been planned, coordinated, and executed with efficiency. Early societies did not have standing armies, but they did have leaders, alliances, and the will to kill, not as hunters, but as humans. It's important not to romanticize these communities, but neither should we demonize them. They were not evil, they were not savages. They were people responding to scarcity, fear, and threat, sometimes with cooperation and sometimes with violence. The difference between survival and extinction was narrow. A failed crop, a sick child, a neighboring group with stronger weapons. And when conflict came, it came with finality. There were no treaties, no trials, no records, only the dead. The violence of early societies was not theatrical. It was not cinematic. It was brutal, efficient, and deeply human. It is carved into the remains of those who fell, and it still speaks, quietly, coldly, from the pit. Death is universal, but how humans have responded to death has never been uniform. In the earliest societies, the treatment of the dead tells us more about the living than about those who perished. It reveals fear, memory, reverence, and sometimes the opposite. Not all bodies were buried with dignity. Some were placed in positions that imply fear, others arranged in patterns that suggest ceremony, and a few were handled as if they posed a threat, even in death. At Talheim, the dead were not buried at all. They were dumped, stacked in a pit. No signs of ritual preparation, no symbolic objects, no protective markers. Their bodies were face down, limbs twisted. The goal was not remembrance, it was removal. But in other prehistoric sites, the dead were treated with greater attention, though not always with compassion. In multiple Neolithic burials across Central and Eastern Europe, archaeologists have uncovered face-down skeletons. These prone burials are not random. They appear in cultural patterns, often associated with individuals believed to have committed taboo acts, suffered abnormal deaths, or posed a perceived danger. The body placed downward was sometimes held in place by large stones placed on the back or limbs. In some cases, heavy rocks were laid across the chest or skull. This practice likely had meaning. It may have been a way to bind the spirit, to prevent the return of a dangerous soul, to isolate it from the community, or to signal disgrace. In Dolny Viestonis, dating back nearly 26,000 years, burials sometimes involved placing animal bones or tools alongside human remains. In one triple burial, a woman and two men were arranged head-to-head in a ritualistic fashion. Red ochre was sprinkled across the bones. The central figure had a severely deformed spine, possibly suggesting that her condition had symbolic meaning, either feared or revered. In other cases, the dead were manipulated after decomposition. At Herxheim, skulls appear to have been deliberately removed from decomposing bodies, cleaned and possibly displayed. Bones were sorted. Skulls were placed in arcs or pits. Some were drilled, others marked with cuts that suggest defleshing. These were not acts of random violence. They were controlled, selective, and almost certainly symbolic. Elsewhere in Çatalhöyük, one of the earliest known urban settlements in modern-day Turkey, circa 7,100 BCE, bodies were sometimes buried beneath the floors of homes. In a few cases, skulls were later removed from the graves and kept separately, possibly for ritual use or ancestral veneration. This practice of skull removal and secondary burial is seen across the Near East and into southeastern Europe. Skulls appear in shrines, embedded in walls, or placed near hearths. Some were plastered, painted, or reshaped. This suggests a continued relationship with the dead, in which certain individuals, perhaps elders or leaders, remained spiritually present long after death. But not all treatments were respectful. In several sites, archaeologists have documented bound limbs, often with bones showing signs of tension or ligature. Some corpses were placed in tight fetal positions, sometimes secured with cord or trapped under stones. Whether this was symbolic of birth and rebirth or an attempt to control the body is debated. Double burials, where two individuals were buried simultaneously, are also found. Sometimes the individuals are clearly related, adult and child, parent and infant, but others are unrelated by sex or age, and the positioning between them appears ceremonial, even oppositional. There are cases where limbs were removed post-mortem. In a few Mesolithic graves, bones from one body appear inside the burial of another, suggesting either symbolic inheritance or perhaps a ritual unification between the dead. At Offnet Cave in Bavaria, Germany, a site dated to circa 6,000 BCE, 27 skulls were found arranged in two shallow pits, each covered with red ochre. The skulls all faced east, and many had been carefully cleaned and positioned. Yet some bore evidence of blunt trauma. This mixture of reverence and violence defies easy interpretation. Were these honored ancestors, ritual victims, enemies. Theories abound: spirit containment, ancestor worship, ritual purification, or magical control. All have been proposed, but the truth remains buried in the absence of written records. What is clear is that early humans saw the dead not as inert objects, but as active presences. The body mattered. Its position, location, and treatment were not random. There was fear. There was intent. And in some cases, the dead were not allowed to rest. Stones in mouths, a practice later seen in medieval vampire burials, are occasionally present in much earlier graves as well. The symbolism is uncertain, but it may represent an attempt to silence the dead or prevent a soul from returning. In one Neolithic burial from Romania, archaeologists found an individual buried with an iron stake driven through the chest, a practice that would later echo in Eastern European folklore. The grave dates far earlier than those stories. Its meaning, however, may not be folklore at all. It may reflect a continuous human anxiety that the dead are not always gone. Burial practices vary dramatically across space and time, but patterns appear. Ochre, used symbolically across continents. Fetal positioning suggesting symbolic rebirth or containment. Skull isolation, indicating reverence, warning, or power. Face-down graves, signaling fear or shame. What unites these practices is not belief in a single god, or fear of a defined afterlife. It is the idea that death did not erase identity, that the dead had to be managed, physically, spiritually, symbolically. Sometimes they were honored, sometimes they were feared, sometimes they were forgotten, but never were they treated as meaningless. Early humans lived in a world full of unknowns: disease, drought, starvation, sudden death. To control the uncontrollable, they developed rituals. They buried, they altered, they contained, they remembered, and sometimes they erased. The way they handled the dead speaks not only to how they lived, but to what they feared most. In the prehistoric world, reproduction was not just biological. It was political. It was economic. It was survival. For early human societies, the continuation of the group depended on a narrow set of reproductive options. Populations were small. Life expectancy was low. The death of a single child or the loss of a young adult could dramatically shift the future of an entire band. But the evidence shows that reproduction was not always equitable, nor was it always consensual. Genetic studies of ancient human remains across Europe, Asia, and Africa reveal a pattern known as reproductive skew, where a small number of males fathered a disproportionate number of children. In some communities, up to 80% of the next generation's Y chromosomes trace back to a single male lineage. The conclusion is unavoidable. Not every man reproduced. Some were excluded. Some died. Others were outcompeted or removed. In contrast, the genetic lineages of females are usually more diverse. This suggests that women were moved between groups, intentionally or forcibly, while men often remained in place. These patterns reflect patrilocal societies, where women left their birth groups upon marriage or capture. In mass graves like Talheim, the absence of adult males and overrepresentation of women and children raises a chilling question. Were the men killed elsewhere, or were only the women and children kept, for labor or for reproduction, with no adults nearby? These were not always ceremonial deaths. Some were likely acts of despair, others of planning. Pregnancy and childbirth were themselves dangerous. Pelvic deformation, healed fractures, and signs of trauma in female skeletons tell a consistent story. Women bore the physical cost of reproduction, often repeatedly and often fatally. Many died before reaching 30. High fertility was expected. Survival was never guaranteed, but even in death, distinctions were made. In some Neolithic cemeteries, men are buried with weapons, tools, or animal bones. Women are buried with beads, children or nothing at all. These patterns suggest a gendered division of value, roles assigned not by identity, but by function. In Dolny Vestones, a triple burial includes 2 males and 1 female. The female, with a severely malformed spine and pelvis, was placed between the others. Her disability might have made her either sacred or expendable. She was covered in ochre, but was she a leader, a symbol, or a sacrifice? The truth is that prehistoric reproduction was not private. It was structural. It involved the group, the clan, the strategy of survival. Who mated, who bore children, who raised them. All were decisions shaped by context, not just desire. And sometimes violence was a part of that decision. Not all human history is driven by compassion. Some of it is driven by necessity. Some of it by domination. The earliest graves, when carefully studied, hint at a world where the ability to reproduce determined who lived, who died, and who was remembered. What began as biology became something more, a system. They left no writing, no letters, no books, no language recorded in stone, but they left something else. Lines of ochre drawn across cave walls, handprints pressed in charcoal, spirals carved into bone, symbols not for survival, but for meaning. For the early humans of the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods, the world was filled with unknowns. Life was short, death was frequent. Illness, hunger, injury, and disappearance were regular parts of experience. And in response, they created patterns. They marked the world with signs. They buried their dead with intention, and they shaped belief from what they could not control. The most direct evidence of this internal life is found in cave art. In the limestone chambers of Chauvet and Lascaux in France and El Castillo in Spain, prehistoric people left behind thousands of painted images: bison, deer, lions, mammoths, and abstract shapes. Some appear layered over generations. Some are placed in locations so deep and dark that reaching them requires crawling through tight passages with only torchlight. These images were not decoration. They were deliberate, possibly ritual, possibly spiritual. Some contain hand stencils, outlines blown in pigment, often with fingers missing or curled. Some may represent counting, gesture, or symbolic loss. Others may simply be the mark of presence. I was here. I mattered. In some cases, animals are drawn with multiple legs or distorted features, as if seen through hallucination. This has led to speculation that early artists may have entered altered mental states before creating the images, through isolation, fasting, or rhythmic movement. While this cannot be proven, the setting and the repetition suggest more than casual illustration. Burials too speak to belief. A single body, placed with care. Ochre sprinkled over the bones. Tools placed nearby. Beads around the neck. These choices suggest not just a disposal of remains, but an act of meaning, a belief that death continued beyond the flesh. At Sungir, in Russia, 2 children were buried side by side more than 30,000 years ago. They were adorned with thousands of ivory beads, fox teeth, spears, and decorated carvings. The richness of the burial implies either status, sacrifice, or spiritual reverence. Yet the children showed no sign of special health or achievement. They were young. They died early, but they were marked as important. Solitary burials tell a different story. In many cases, individuals were buried far from settlements, without goods, without care. Some were placed in caves, others in shallow pits. Some were positioned in fetal poses. Others were left face down with limbs bound. These burials often involve individuals with signs of injury, illness, or difference, perhaps social outcasts or victims of internal tension. The reasons are uncertain. They may have been feared, shunned, or symbolically removed. In rare cases, the same site contains both richly adorned burials and isolated ones, suggesting a community with internal divisions. Who was honored and who was erased was not random. Emotional trauma is harder to detect in bone, but it leaves traces, patterns of repetitive injury, self-healed fractures, and signs of chronic infection show that long-term suffering was common. Joint degeneration and stress indicators suggest individuals who lived with pain for years, often without aid. In child burials, some skeletons show signs of rickets, anemia, or prolonged malnutrition. These are not just physical conditions. They reflect extended emotional environments of scarcity, stress, and instability. In El Sidran Cave, the remains of 12 Neanderthals, mostly from the same family, were found together. Their bones showed signs of cannibalism, but also of disease, developmental delay, and genetic isolation. Their teeth and bones reflected a population on the edge, physically, genetically, and socially. In such environments, depression, grief, and fear were not anomalies, they were constants. And though we cannot interview the dead, we can observe the structures they left: cave sanctuaries, burial choices, symbolic markings, and infer that their inner world was not blank. They felt loss, they marked absence, they planned for death. There are also signs of spiritual dread. In some burials, individuals are pinned under stones. In others, skulls are removed long after death. In rare cases, bones are burned while the body remains whole, perhaps in an attempt to cleanse or protect the community from contamination. The belief that death could spread, or that the dead could return, appears in cultures around the world. And while such interpretations must be cautious, the consistency of ritual control over the body suggests a belief in forces beyond the physical. In prehistoric Europe, rings of stones, isolated graves in remote areas, and signs of deliberate mutilation post-mortem all suggest attempts to manage something feared, perhaps a spirit, a curse, or a memory. What emerges from these layers is not a complete psychology, but a structure, a framework of belief formed in the absence of writing, built from gesture, repetition, and fear. In isolation, prehistoric humans created meaning. In pain, they created ritual. And in death, they created memory. What they believed cannot be quoted, but it can be seen in the curve of a cave painting, in the care of a child's burial, and in the silences of those left alone. The past does not vanish. It mutates. The behaviors of early human groups, their violence, their rituals, their fears, did not disappear with the end of the Paleolithic. They evolved, shaping the structure of future societies in ways both visible and hidden. The mass graves of Talheim and Nataruk were not anomalies. They were early signs of something deeper, that conflict, control, and remembrance were already embedded in human life. And these patterns did not end with the Neolithic. As early farming cultures spread across Europe and Asia, the structures of violence grew more defined. Defensive settlements began to appear: walls, moats, ditches. The archaeological record at sites like Schletz Asparn shows clear evidence of organized defense and organized destruction. By 4500 BCE, entire communities had already adopted protective architecture in anticipation of attack. The idea of eliminating rivals, seen in prehistoric massacres, would later evolve into ritual executions, state punishment, and military conquest. From prehistoric weapon blows to ceremonial beheadings and Bronze Age barrows, violence became formalized. It moved from survival to ideology. Ritual treatment of the dead also continued. Practices once seen in scattered caves became common cultural norms. At Jericho, skulls were removed, plastered, and painted, placed in shrines or homes. At Çatalhöyük, bodies were buried beneath domestic floors, and in some cases later, disturbed or reused. These practices echo the earlier patterns of skull isolation and body manipulation, not as random acts, but as systematic responses to death and memory. The fear of the dead returning, implied by stones placed on corpses in the Neolithic, carried forward. In medieval Europe, so-called vampire burials featured bodies pinned with stakes, decapitated or weighed down. Though separated by thousands of years, the logic remained: secure the corpse, protect the living. Sacrificial behavior, possibly hinted at in Herxheim and Dolní Věstonice, reappears in recorded history with clear documentation, from Sumerian royal burials to Aztec temples. Though methods and meanings varied, the structure was consistent. Some lives were offered to ensure others continued. The connection between burial and identity, too, remained intact, just as Paleolithic graves often include gendered artifacts. Later societies buried individuals according to role, class, and function. Priests with relics, warriors with weapons, children with symbols of innocence or transition. Even the reproductive patterns seen in genetic data, skewed male lineages, movement of women between groups, continued in historical monarchies, tribal systems, and empires. Power remained tied to biological control, often expressed through lineage, marriage, and forced migration. What was once survival became structure. What was once necessity became law. The belief systems hinted at in cave art and symbolic burial grew into full cosmologies. From ochre-painted bones to elaborate pyramids and tombs, the human desire to commemorate, fear, and influence death expanded, but did not begin with civilization. And the behaviors of the isolated, the grieving, the afraid, they never vanished. We find echoes of early mental frameworks in later rituals of mourning, taboos around the dead, in sacred symbols, and in protective spells. We find them in myths, stories of restless spirits, cursed graves, and forbidden places. We find them in folk tales about ancestors watching, punishing, or returning. Prehistoric humans did not have mythologies in the modern sense, but they had frameworks. They had behavior patterns that would become the psychological roots of religion, morality, and law. The legacies are not metaphors. They are real. Every fortified city wall has a precursor in a ditch dug around a Neolithic farm. Every gravesite organized by class or rank reflects the first decision to bury one body with beads and another with nothing. Every war over land, every conquest for resources, traces back to the moment when two small bands met at a river and one walked away. Human culture was not born in peace. It was born in adaptation, in the choices made at the edge of survival. Some of those choices were violent, some were reverent, all were formative. The bones in the ground, the tools in the dust, the ochre on the walls. They are not distant relics. They are foundations. The past is not behind us. It is beneath us. And in many ways, it still guides us. We began with a grave, a pit in Talheim, bodies stacked without care, skulls shattered, children discarded beside the elderly. No monuments, no offerings, just a silence too deep for words. That silence is not empty. It holds answers, if we are willing to look closely. The deaths at Talheim, at Nataruk, and at dozens of other sites across prehistoric Europe and Africa are not just evidence of tragedy. They are evidence of structure. These were not random killings. They were systematic acts, coordinated, intentional, the result of human choices made in environments of scarcity, tension, and fear. For centuries, we told ourselves that war came later, with kings and cities. But the bones prove otherwise. Violence existed before law, before states, before written words. Not as an anomaly, but as an option, exercised when the costs seemed justified. The people who made those choices were not monsters. They were not unlike us. They grieved, they raised children, they buried their dead with care, and sometimes without it. They survived in a world that punished error, in a world where one bad season could end a lineage. In that world, decisions were made. Some involved abandonment. Some involved infanticide. Some involved rituals, sacrifice, or exclusion. Some involved murder. Every act left a mark, on the ground, in the bones, across generations. What emerges is not a picture of evil, but of fragility, a long struggle to persist. And in that struggle, the lines between care and cruelty, between ritual and fear, between survival and violence, often blurred. But there is another truth beneath these graves. Even in the harshest conditions, humans created meaning. They shaped burials, painted walls, crafted beads, honored children, arranged bones. They marked loss with color. They sought to remember or to forget. And sometimes they buried their dead facing the earth, not the sky. The Talheim grave remains one of the clearest windows we have into the emotional cost of prehistory. Not because of its brutality, but because of its familiarity. It shows that the choices we make today about memory, justice, power, and fear are not new. They are old, and they have been with us since the beginning. The first graves were not peaceful places. They were battlegrounds of memory. They were records of what we chose to become, and sometimes what we chose to leave behind. This is not a story about cavemen. It is a story about us, about what it costs to be human, and what we're willing to do to remain that way.